Jerusalem sometime in the late 620s before Christ. The temple still stands on Zion, but its courts are cluttered with altars that should not be there. Manasseh, the longest reigning king in Judah's history, has been dead less than a decade, and his work has not been undone. Baal still has his priests in the city. Milcom of the Ammonites still has his platform. On the flat rooftops, men still climb at dusk to bow toward the host of heaven. The boy who sits on David's throne is named Josiah. He was 8 years old when his father Amon was murdered, and the people of the land set him there. He is now in his late teens. The great reform that will give him his name in history, the reform of his 18th year, when the book of the law will be found in the temple, is still several years away. Into this Jerusalem, half cleansed and half corrupted, a prophet steps forward whose name almost no one knows. He is not from a priestly line like Ezekiel. He does not begin with a vision in the year a king died, like Isaiah. The book that bears his name opens, in Zephaniah 1 verse 1, with the most unusual genealogy of any prophet in the Hebrew canon: son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah. 4 generations, royal generations, almost certainly. The prophet whose name means Yahweh has hidden steps out of the shadow of Manasseh, and Amon carrying, it seems, the blood of Hezekiah in his veins. His book is small, 3 chapters, 53 verses. A reader can finish it in under 10 minutes. And yet, into those 53 verses, Zephaniah compresses what no other prophet of the Old Testament compresses: the entire shape of what Israel called Yom YHWH, the day of the Lord, the cosmic judgment of the whole earth, the specific judgment of Judah and Jerusalem, the oracles against the nations from Philistia to Nineveh, the final restoration of a purified remnant under a singing king. All of it in a single tight scroll, in a density no other prophet matches. This is why a forgotten prophet, 3 short chapters, and 1 young king in a half-reformed Jerusalem matter. The dies irae of the medieval Latin Requiem was lifted, almost word for word, from this book. The language Paul uses for the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians, the language Peter uses in 2 Peter, the imagery John of Patmos uses in Revelation, all of it traces back, somewhere along its line, to these 53 verses written under Josiah. The names that will return through the rest of this story: Maktesh, Philistia, Moab, Cush, Nineveh, the remnant, all begin here, in a city that did not yet know it was 3 decades away from its own fall. The genealogy that opens the book in Zephaniah 1 verse 1, the 4-generation line that climbs from the prophet through Cushi, Gedaliah, Amariah, and ends at Hezekiah, is the single most unusual feature of any prophetic introduction in the Hebrew canon. Most prophets are given 1 ancestor, sometimes 2. Joel, son of Pethuel, Micah of Moresheth, Habakkuk simply called the prophet. Zephaniah is given 4. Every commentator who has worked on this book in the modern era has had to face the same question. Why stop the genealogy at Hezekiah? And why bother mounting 4 generations only to land on a name that, in Judah's collective memory, would have meant only one thing? Adele Berlin, in the Anchor Bible commentary on Zephaniah, argues that the only credible reason to climb 4 generations and stop precisely at Hezekiah is that the editor of the book wanted to make a claim, quietly but unmistakably, about the prophet's blood. The Hezekiah at the top of the line is, almost certainly, King Hezekiah of Judah, the great reformer who reigned roughly from 715 to 687 before Christ. Marvin Sweeney, in his commentary on the 12 prophets in the Beret Olam series, points out that the timeline works without strain. 4 generations from Hezekiah to Zephaniah covers roughly a century, which fits the gap between Hezekiah's death and Josiah's early reign almost exactly. The math behaves, and if the math behaves, the implication is heavy. Zephaniah is, by descent, a member of the Davidic royal house. He is a great-great-grandson of one of the few kings of Judah whom the books of Kings remember without ambivalence. He carries Hezekiah's blood into a court that has just emerged from Manasseh, Hezekiah's own son, the king who undid everything his father had done. That detail changes the temperature of every line that follows. The man who opens his mouth in this book against the priests of Baal and the rooftop worshippers of the host of heaven is not an outsider shouting from a village. He is, by descent, a member of the royal family, the reformer's bloodline returning into a court that had been corrupted by Manasseh and only partially purged by Josiah's first cautious reforms. The name Cushi, the prophet's father, has provoked some debate over whether it indicates a Cushite, that is, a Nubian or Ethiopian ancestor, but most modern commentators, including Berlin and Sweeney, treat the name simply as a Hebrew personal name without necessary ethnic content. The weight of the genealogy lies not in Cushi, it lies in Hezekiah. The same opening verse anchors the book in time. The word came to Zephaniah, the text says, during the reign of Josiah son of Ammon, king of Judah. Josiah's reign covers roughly 640 to 609 before Christ, a span of 31 years. But Zephaniah's prophecies cannot fit anywhere inside that span. They have to fit in a narrower window, and the text itself tells us where. In Zephaniah 1, verses 4 and 5, the prophet attacks 3 specific religious practices in Jerusalem. The priests of Baal, the worshippers of the starry host on the rooftops, and those who swear by the Lord and by Milcom in the same breath. All 3 of those cults were aggressively eradicated by Josiah in his 18th year when, according to 2 Kings 22 and 23, the book of the law was found in the temple, and the great reform began. After 622 before Christ, none of those 3 had public infrastructure left in the city, which means Zephaniah's oracle has to be earlier. Edwin Thiele, in his foundational chronology of the kings of Israel and Judah, dated Josiah's reign with enough precision that scholars now place Zephaniah's ministry with broad confidence between roughly 635 and 625 before Christ, after Josiah took limited reform steps in his 12th year, and before he took the dramatic ones in his 18th. A window of perhaps 10 years, possibly less. The geopolitical map that frames that window matters. In 627 before Christ, the great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal died, and the empire that had held the Near East in a grip of iron for almost a century began to wobble. Babylon, which had been a vassal province for generations, started flexing toward independence under Nabopolassar. Egypt, which had been suppressed under Assyria's heel, was rising again under the 26th dynasty, and in Jerusalem, the boy king on David's throne was old enough to begin asking what kind of king he would be, but not yet old enough to have answered. Into that suspended moment, with the world rearranging itself overhead and the city below not yet aware of how short the time was, Zephaniah opened his mouth. He did not begin small. The first sentence of his prophecy, after the introductory formula, is a sweep across the entire surface of the earth. Zephaniah 1 verses 2 and 3 in the New International Version reads, "I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord, I will sweep away both man and beast. I will sweep away the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea, and the idols that cause the wicked to stumble. When I destroy all mankind on the face of the earth, declares the Lord, I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. The verb translated sweep, away, is the Hebrew asoph. The verb asaph repeated in an emphatic doubling, literally gathering I will gather away. It is a strange and harsh construction, the kind of phrasing Hebrew uses when ordinary verbs cannot carry the weight of what is being said. What is being said is theological reversal. The order of beings the prophet lists: humans, beasts, birds of the air, fish of the sea, is the exact list of Genesis 1 in reverse. Genesis creates fish and birds on the 5th day, livestock and humans on the 6th. Zephaniah unmakes them in the opposite order. The opening of the book is a deliberate, surgical inversion of the creation account. This is not a cleanup, this is a decreation. Hosea 4 verse 3 had already used a similar register. The land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea are swept away. Jeremiah 4 verses 23 to 26 would soon use it again. I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty, and at the heavens, and their light was gone. But Zephaniah condenses the theme into 2 verses at the very head of the book. The day of the Lord in his hand does not just destroy enemies, it uncreates the world. And only then does the prophet narrow his lens. Having opened with the cosmos, he focuses in Zephaniah 1, verse 4, on the specific city in front of him. The targets are exact: the priests of Baal, by name, the pagan and idolatrous priests called Kemerim, the technical Hebrew word for non-Levitical, syncretistic clergy. Those who bow on the rooftops to the starry host, the Mesopotamian astral cult that Manasseh had imported and that survived into Josiah's early years. Those who swear by the Lord and by Milcom in the same breath, holding 2 contradictory loyalties at once. The diagnosis is precise. This is not a city that has rejected Yahweh outright. This is a city that has tried to keep him alongside other gods, and the prophet treats that as the more dangerous heresy. Verse 8 widens the indictment to the political class. On the day of the Lord's sacrifice, the text reads, I will punish the officials and the king's sons, and all those clad in foreign clothes. The phrase foreign clothes is not random. It refers to the courtly habit of adopting Assyrian or Egyptian fashion as a marker of cosmopolitan sophistication, the way Judah's elite imitated the dress of their imperial overlords. Verse 9 adds, On that day I will punish all who avoid stepping on the threshold. That obscure phrase has been argued over for centuries, and the most plausible explanation, defended by both Berlin and Sweeney, connects it to the Philistine custom recorded in 1 Samuel 5 verse 5, when Dagon's idol fell and broke at his threshold, and the priests of Dagon afterward refused to step on it. Some Judean elites, the prophet implies, have absorbed Philistine ritual habits into their own behavior in the temple itself. In verses 10 and 11, the prophet's eye moves through the city geography. He hears a cry from the fish gate on the northern wall, the gate where merchants entering from the coastal routes would have brought in the day's catch. He hears wailing from the new quarter, the Mishneh, the 2nd district, and he hears a great crash from the hills. Then comes the line that will name a place into the imagination of every reader of this book. Wail, the prophet says, you who live in the market district. All your merchants will be wiped out. All who trade with silver will be destroyed. The market district is the Hebrew Maktesh, literally the mortar, named for the bowl-shaped depression in the topography of Jerusalem where the merchants gathered. Until the late 20th century, no one was sure exactly where Maktesh stood. Then, between 1969 and 1982, the Israeli archaeologist Nahman Avigat led a systematic excavation of the Jewish quarter of the Old City and uncovered a thick layer of late 8th and 7th century construction on the Western Hill, including a residential and commercial expansion that perfectly matched the Mishneh and Maktesh districts, named in the prophets. The Tyropoeon Valley, the depression separating the Temple Mount from the Western Hill, runs exactly where the bowl-shaped Zephaniah names would have lain. Avigad's spade gave us the city Zephaniah was looking at. The merchants whose silver and gold, the prophet says, will not save them were the inhabitants of houses. Avigad's team was uncovering 26 centuries later. Verses 12 and 13 push the indictment further down. At that time, the text reads, "I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent, who are like wine left on its dregs, who think the Lord will do nothing, either good or bad." The image is of a careful householder going through every dark corner of the city by lamplight, finding the men who have settled into spiritual sediment. The metaphor of wine left on its dregs is pointed. Undisturbed wine grows thick, sour, and stubborn at the bottom. The prophet is not after open rebels. He is after the comfortable. And then, in verses 14 through 18, the prophet steps fully into the language that would echo through every subsequent generation of theological imagination. Zephaniah 1 verses 14 to 18 in the New International Version reads, "The great day of the Lord is near, near and coming quickly. The cry on the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty warrior shouts his battle cry. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. I will bring such distress on all people that they will grope about like those who are blind, because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood will be poured out like dust, and their entrails like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. In the fire of his jealousy, the whole earth will be consumed, for he will make a sudden end of all who live on the earth. 6 days stacked one on top of the other. Wrath, distress and anguish, trouble and ruin, darkness and gloom, clouds and blackness, trumpet and battle cry. No other prophet ever wrote a passage like that. Amos, in chapter 5, verses 18 to 20, had warned the northern kingdom that those who longed for the day of the Lord did not understand what they were asking for. That day will be darkness, not light. But Amos delivered the warning in 3 verses. Zephaniah expands those 3 into 5 and turns them into a hammered cadence of repeated nouns. Joel, writing later, would draw directly from Zephaniah's vocabulary in Joel 2 verses 1 and 2, where the line, "a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness," appears almost as a direct quotation. And almost 2,000 years later, in the early 13th century after Christ, a Franciscan named Thomas of Celano sat down to write a sequence for the Latin Requiem Mass and lifted, almost word for word, the opening line of his hymn from Zephaniah 1 verse 15. Dies irae, dies illa, solvet seclum in favilla. Day of wrath, that day will dissolve the age in ashes. The hymn would stand at the heart of the Roman Catholic Requiem until the post-Vatican II liturgical reform of 1970 removed it from the standard order of the Requiem Mass. For 7 centuries, every funeral the Latin Church performed for the most prominent of its dead opened with words copied out of a book most worshippers in the pews had never read. That is what Zephaniah does in the first chapter alone. He opens with a cosmic reversal of Genesis. He moves into a precise map of the religious sin of one specific city. He names neighborhoods that archaeology would not confirm for another 2.5 millennia. And he closes the chapter with the single most quotable sequence on divine judgment in the entire Hebrew Bible. The sequence that would furnish the medieval West with its picture of the end of the world. All of this still inside chapter 1. The book has not yet turned to the nations. The prophet has not yet named Nineveh. He has not yet uttered the word remnant. He is only setting the stage. If chapter 1 closes the curtain on Judah, chapter 2 lifts the prophet's voice across borders. But before the oracles against the nations begin, Zephaniah pauses. He inserts in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, the only conditional offer in the entire book. Gather together, gather yourselves together, you shameful nation, before the appointed time arrives and that day sweeps on like chaff, before the fierce anger of the Lord comes upon you. Before the day of the Lord's wrath comes upon you. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, you who do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. The Hebrew verb at the head of the passage, kabatz, gather yourselves, sits in a deliberate echo of the Asaph doubling at the head of chapter 1. Where God had said, I will gather them away. Now the prophet says, gather yourselves before that day comes. The verb of judgment becomes in the same breath a verb of repentance. The prophet who in chapter 1 spoke without conditional clauses suddenly speaks in conditional clauses. The pivot turns on a single word, perhaps. That word, in Hebrew ulai, is the most fragile word in the prophetic vocabulary. It is the word a prophet uses when he is not allowed to promise, but is also not allowed to despair. Joel uses it in chapter 2, verse 14. Who knows? He may turn and relent. Amos uses it in chapter 5, verse 15. Perhaps the Lord God Almighty will have mercy. Zephaniah, in his own voice, uses it once, here, and the people he is addressing, the only ones who receive the conditional, are the Anavim, the humble, the bowed down, the ones who do not have the rooftops on which others worshipped the host of heaven, the ones who do not have Assyrian-style robes to wear at court. The phrase Jesus would later use almost word for word. In Matthew 5, verse 5, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, runs through Zephaniah's Anavim before it reaches the Sermon on the Mount. Then the prophet turns his face westward toward the coastal plain. The first oracle against the nations is delivered in chapter 2, verses 4 through 7, against Philistia. 4 cities are named: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron. 5 Philistine cities had once formed the famous pentapolis of the southern coast: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Zephaniah names only 4. Gath is missing. By the prophet's day, Gath had already been reduced to insignificance, devastated by Hazael of Aram in the late 9th century before Christ, and never recovering its independence. Wait, Zephaniah's silence about Gath is itself a chronological marker. He names what is still standing: Gaza will be abandoned and Ashkelon left in ruins, the prophet says. At midday, Ashdod will be emptied and Ekron uprooted. The Hebrew of those 4 lines is held together by a punning device that does not survive in English translation, but that any first hearer would have caught. Gaza, Azza, will be abandoned Azuvah. Ekron will be uprooted, Teaker. The names of the cities become the verbs of their destruction. The prophet, speaking before any of these cities had fallen, was already pronouncing them by sounds that contained their own end. Of the 4 Philistine cities Zephaniah named, the one that has yielded the most archaeological flesh in the modern era is Ekron. Beginning in 1981 and running through the mid-1990s, a joint American-Israeli expedition led by Trude Dothan of Hebrew University and Seymour Gittin of the WF. Albright Institute excavated the mound known today as Tel Mikne, about 35 kilometers west of Jerusalem. In 1996, in the final season of digging, the team uncovered, in the ruins of a temple in the lower city, a royal dedicatory inscription on a limestone block. The text, published in 1997 by Gittin, Dothan, and the epigrapher Joseph Naver in the Israel Exploration Journal, names the city explicitly, Ekron, and lists 5 generations of its rulers, ending with a king named Achish, son of Padi. Padi is a king known from Assyrian sources, from the annals of Sennacherib, who freed him from imprisonment in Jerusalem during the campaign of 701 before Christ. The Ekron inscription closed a debate that had run for almost a century. The mound was indeed Ekron, the city Zephaniah had named, and the building the inscription stood in had been violently destroyed in the early 6th century before Christ in the same Babylonian sweep that would soon take Jerusalem. The prophet's line about Ekron uprooted was not metaphor. Then the prophet swings east. Chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, addresses Moab and Ammon, the 2 Transjordanian peoples whom Genesis 19 traced back to Lot and his daughters after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The connection is not accidental. I have heard the insults of Moab and the taunts of the Ammonites, the prophet writes, who insulted my people and made threats against their land. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, surely Moab will become like Sodom, the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a place of weeds and salt pits, a wasteland forever. The very peoples descended, in Hebrew tradition, from the survivors of Sodom and Gomorrah will themselves become Sodom and Gomorrah. The narrative loop closes on itself. The historical bite of the oracle is sharpened by the Mesha Stele, the basalt monument discovered in 1868 at Deban in modern Jordan, and now held at the Louvre. The Stele, set up by Mesha, king of Moab, in the mid-9th century before Christ, boasts in his own voice that his god Chemosh delivered him from Israel, and that he, Mesha, slaughtered 7,000 Israelites for the glory of Chemosh. The taunting that Zephaniah says God has heard from Moab was a long-running cultural practice, recorded in stone 2 centuries before the prophet ever spoke. Chemosh and Milcom, the Moabite and Ammonite national gods, are named together by Zephaniah in chapter 2, verse 11, where the prophet declares that the Lord will be awesome to them when he destroys all the gods of the earth, and that the nations on every distant shore will eventually bow to him. That last clause widens the oracle. The judgment on Moab and Ammon is not a private dispute. It is a piece of a global theological agenda. In a single short verse, chapter 2, verse 12, the prophet pivots from the Transjordan all the way to the south. You Cushites too will be slain by my sword. That is the entire oracle against Cush. One verse, but the geographical reach matters. Cush in the Hebrew Bible refers to the kingdom that lay south of Egypt, encompassing modern southern Egypt, Sudan, and parts of Ethiopia. By Zephaniah's day, Cush had recently held all of Egypt itself. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, the so-called Kushite or Nubian dynasty, had ruled Egypt for the better part of a century, from roughly 744 to 656 before Christ. Its most famous king, Taharka, called Tirhaka in 2 Kings 19 verse 9, where he marches north to confront Sennacherib of Assyria during Hezekiah's siege, had fought the Assyrians directly in the Levant within Zephaniah's grandparents' lifetime. The 25th dynasty had been driven back south of Egypt by Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal in the 660s before Christ, and a native Egyptian Sate dynasty, the 26th, had taken Egypt back. But the Kushite kingdom in the Upper Nile remained a real political weight. Zephaniah's brief verse against Cush is not a stray geographic insult. It is a recognition that the day of the Lord reaches as far south as the Hebrew imagination knew the world to extend. And then in chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, the prophet turns to the heaviest oracle of the chapter, the one against Assyria and against Nineveh, its capital. He will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, leaving Nineveh utterly desolate and dry as the desert. Flocks and herds will lie down there, creatures of every kind. The desert owl and the screech owl will roost on her columns. Their hooting will echo through the windows. Rubble will fill the doorways. The beams of cedar will be exposed. This is the city of revelry that lived in safety. She said to herself, I am the one, and there is none besides me. What a ruin she has become, a lair for wild beasts. All who pass by her scoff and shake their fists. The line, I am the one, and there is none besides me, is a deliberate echo with deadly irony of the language Yahweh uses about himself in Isaiah 45. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Nineveh, in Zephaniah's mouth, has been quoting back to herself the very language of God. The prophet is not just predicting her fall, he is unmasking her theology. Nineveh fell in the summer of 612 before Christ, almost certainly within the lifetime either of Zephaniah himself or of his immediate hearers. The fall is recorded with precision in cuneiform, in the document modern scholarship calls the Babylonian Chronicle, specifically the tablet catalogued as British Museum 21901, the so-called Fall of Nineveh Chronicle. The tablet, edited and translated for English readers by Donald J. Wiseman in his 1956 publication Chronicles of Chaldean Kings, and in later editions by A.K. Grayson, gives the campaign of Nabopolassar of Babylon and Cyaxares of Media, who in the 14th year of Nabopolassar's reign besieged Nineveh from June through August of 612 before Christ breached its walls and burned it. The chronicle records that the king of Assyria, Sin-shar-ishkun, perished in the fall of his own capital, and that the Babylonians and Medes carried away spoil from the city for days. The empire that had ruled the Near East for almost 2 centuries collapsed within a single summer. Zephaniah's line that the city would lie utterly desolate and dry as the desert was, within roughly a generation of his prophecy, literal fact. For about 25 centuries afterward, no one knew with certainty where Nineveh had stood. The site had vanished into low mounds along the eastern bank of the Tigris River, across from modern Mosul. In December of 1845, the Englishman Austin Henry Layard began excavating one of those mounds, the one called Kuyunjik, on a small grant from Stratford Canning. the British ambassador in Constantinople. By March of 1847, Layard had uncovered the palace of Sennacherib of Assyria, with its enormous bas-reliefs, including the famous panels depicting the siege of Lachish in Hezekiah's day. By the early 1850s, with further work by Layard, by his Iraqi-born assistant Hormuz Rassam, and later by George Smith of the British Museum, the identity of Kuyunjik as Nineveh was established beyond doubt. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, including the cuneiform tablets that would later yield the Epic of Gilgamesh, was recovered from beneath the rubble. Layard, in the memoirs he later published, described those mounds before excavation as immense and silent, with only wind and the cries of birds for company. The line in Zephaniah 2 verse 14, that the desert owl and the screech owl will roost on her columns, describes with archaeological precision what Layard's spades found. A city whose defining buildings had been buried, whose cedar beams had been exposed and burned, whose human population was gone, and whose only inhabitants for 2.5 millennia had been wild birds and the occasional shepherd. What chapter 2 does, taken whole, is something almost no other prophet manages in a single chapter. It moves from the doorstep of Judah westward to Philistia, eastward to Moab and Ammon, southward to Cush, and northward to Nineveh, the 4 points of the compass, traced in 15 verses. The day of the Lord, in Zephaniah's hand, is not provincial. It does not care about the borders of Israel. It moves with the surface of the known earth itself, naming city after city, until every horizon the prophet's audience could see has been marked. And in the case of Nineveh, the most powerful of those names, history would within a single generation prove him exactly right. If chapters 1 and 2 of Zephaniah work outward from Jerusalem to the cosmos and then to the 4 corners of the known earth, chapter 3 closes the spiral by returning to Jerusalem. The prophet who has surveyed Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Cush, and Nineveh now plants his feet again in the city he started in, and the second time he speaks of her, the woe is louder. Chapter 3 verses 1 through 5 reads, "Woe to the city of oppressors, rebellious and defiled. She obeys no one, she accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. Her officials within her are roaring lions. Her rulers are evening wolves, who leave nothing for the morning. Her prophets are unprincipled. They are treacherous people. Her priests profane the sanctuary and do violence to the law. The Lord within her is righteous. He does no wrong. Morning by morning he dispenses his justice, and every new day he does not fail. Yet the unrighteous know no shame." The diagnosis sharpens what chapter 1 had already named. There the prophet had targeted ritual sins. Here he names the moral and institutional sins. Officials are lions. Rulers are evening wolves who leave nothing for the morning. The image of a predator that does not even pace itself. The prophets are pochazim, light, frivolous, treacherous men. The priests violate the very sanctuary they are supposed to guard. The same diagnosis appears in Isaiah 1 verse 23. Your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves. And in Jeremiah 5 verses 30 and 31, the prophets prophesy lies, the priests rule by their own authority. Zephaniah is speaking the same diagnosis his contemporaries Jeremiah and the editors of Isaiah's later layers were speaking, but Zephaniah condenses it to a single quatrain of leadership groups. Officials, rulers, prophets, priests, every layer of institutional Judah is corrupt, and yet the prophet says, "The Lord remains in her midst. righteous, dispensing justice morning by morning. The contrast between the city's leadership and the God who still inhabits her is the engine of the chapter. Then in chapter 3 verses 6 through 8 comes one of the most theologically pointed passages in the entire book. I have destroyed nations. The prophet quotes God as saying, their strongholds are demolished. I have left their streets deserted, with no one passing through. Their cities are laid waste. They are deserted and empty. Of Jerusalem I thought, surely you will fear me and accept correction. Then her place of refuge would not be destroyed, nor all my punishments come upon her. But they were still eager to act corruptly in all they did. Therefore wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day I will stand up to testify. The argument is theodicy by analogy. Yahweh has already destroyed nations. Their streets are empty. Their walls are rubble. Jerusalem watched it happen. Within Zephaniah's lifetime, or in the immediate memory of his audience, Samaria had fallen to Sargon the Sioux of Assyria in 722 before Christ. The entire northern kingdom of Israel deported and replaced with peoples from elsewhere in the empire. Within his audience's lifetime, the Aramean states of Damascus and Hamath had fallen. The Phoenician cities had been crushed under Esarhaddon. The kingdom of Israel, the brother kingdom right across the border, had been erased a century earlier, and its survivors absorbed or scattered. Judah had every available case study in front of her. The prophet's argument is not that Jerusalem cannot imagine the day of the Lord. It is that she has watched the day of the Lord happen to other people, and has chosen to assume that she alone is exempt. Surely you will fear me and accept correction. The prophet quotes God as having thought. The Hebrew phrasing is poignant. It is the language of a parent who hoped, against the evidence, that the next child would learn from the punishment of the first. And then, sharply, the tone of the book turns. Beginning at chapter 3, verse 9, Zephaniah pivots into a section that has confused commentators for 2.5 millennia, because it does not look like the same prophet. Then I will purify the lips of the peoples, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord, and serve him shoulder to shoulder. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, my scattered people, will bring me offerings. The phrase purify the lips of the peoples, Safa Berura, in Hebrew, a clean lip, is a deliberate reversal of Genesis 11. In the Tower of Babel narrative, God confused human language as judgment for human pride. Now, in Zephaniah's vision, God restores a single pure language to all peoples, so that they may call on his name together. The language barrier introduced in Genesis 11 is dismantled in Zephaniah 3 verse 9. Adele Berlin in her commentary, and O. Palmer Robertson in his commentary on Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament series, both note that this is the reversal not just of Babel, but of every previous oracle Zephaniah has just delivered. The same Cush whose people the prophet had said in 2 verse 12 would be slain by the sword now becomes, in 3 verse 10, the place from which God's own scattered worshippers come to bring him offerings. The geography of judgment becomes, in 2 chapters, the geography of mission. The line from Cush is not nationalism, it is universalism. Wherever the day of the Lord reached to destroy, the morning after the day reaches to gather. The New Testament hears this passage clearly. In Acts 2, when the Spirit falls at Pentecost, and the disciples speak in many languages, and the assembled crowd from every nation under heaven hears the wonders of God in their own tongue, Luke is presenting the fulfillment of what Zephaniah promised, a unified worship through purified speech. In Revelation 7, when John of Patmos sees the great multitude that no one could number from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and the Lamb, he is seeing what Zephaniah described. Whether the prophet's original horizon was the post-exilic restoration of Judah or a more distant eschatology has been debated since the rabbinic period and continues to be debated. Berlin reads the passage as immediately post-exilic. Robertson reads it as fundamentally messianic. Both readings agree that the trajectory of the verse arcs forward well beyond the Jerusalem of Josiah into a horizon the prophet himself could only point at. The remnant emerges in chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. On that day you, Jerusalem, will not be put to shame for all the wrongs you have done to me, because I will remove from you your arrogant boasters. Never again will you be haughty on my holy hill, but I will leave within you the meek and humble. The remnant of Israel will trust in the name of the Lord. They will do no wrong. They will tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. The vocabulary is the same vocabulary Zephaniah used at the start of chapter 2, to describe the only people who would be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger, the meek and humble. In chapter 2, they were a hopeful possibility. Perhaps they would be sheltered. In chapter 3, they are an accomplished reality. They will be left. They will trust. They will not lie. The conditional has hardened into a promise. And the description of them is striking. They will not lie. They will eat and lie down without fear. The most ordinary marks of ordinary peace, eating, sleeping, telling the truth, become the marks of the eschatological people. There is no temple here, no kingdom, no military, only people who can sleep without fear. That portrait, refined and inverted, would arrive on a Galilean hillside almost 6 centuries later in the 3rd Beatitude of Matthew 5, and then, in verses 14 through 17, the book opens into the section that no other Old Testament prophet quite matches. Zephaniah 3 verses 14 through 17 in the New International Version reads, "Sing, daughter Zion, shout aloud, Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day they will say to Jerusalem, do not fear, Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord, your God, is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing." That last clause, "he will rejoice over you with singing," is a verbal image found nowhere else in the entire Old Testament. The God of Israel is described in the prophetic literature as speaking, judging, weeping, withholding speech, withdrawing his presence. He is described occasionally as singing his judgment as a dirge, as in the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah 5. But God singing with delight over his redeemed people. God, as the joyful singer over Zion, appears here and only here. The Hebrew verb yagil, rejoice, appears with the noun rinna, song, in a construction so specific that medieval Jewish commentators puzzled over it, and Christianer. Commentators built whole theological architectures on it. That same passage carried, in the medieval Latin Vulgate, the reading that became central to Marian piety in the Western Church. Jerome's translation of verses 14 through 17 was read each year, on the Feast of the Visitation, and at multiple Marian celebrations, as a foreshadowing of the Annunciation. The Philia Sion, the daughter of Zion, exhorted to rejoice, because the King is in her midst. Luke 1 verse 28, when the angel says to Mary, "Rejoice, highly favored one," uses the Greek verb share. The same imperative the Septuagint of Zephaniah 3 verse 14 applies to daughter Zion. Whether Luke had Zephaniah specifically in mind, or whether he was working with broader prophetic vocabulary, the medieval Western Church heard the connection unmistakably and embedded it in liturgy. But the deeper claim in these verses is the line at the heart of the passage, repeated twice in slightly different form. "The Lord your God is with you." In Hebrew, YHWH, Elohaicha Bekirbecha. The phrase is anti-exilic in the most literal sense. The exile that Zephaniah's contemporaries are about to enter, that his disciple generation will live through, that Ezekiel will describe as the departure of the glory of God from the temple in chapter 10 of his own book, is not the last word. The God who left will return. The God who returns will not just be present, he will sing. The book does not end with the singing. After verses 14 through 17, Zephaniah closes with 3 more verses, the gathering coda of chapter 3, verses 18 through 20. "I will remove from you all who mourn over the loss of your appointed festivals, which is a burden and reproach for you. At that time I will deal with all who oppressed you. I will rescue the lame. I will gather the exiles. I will give them praise and honor in every land where they have suffered shame. At that time I will gather you. At that time I will bring you home. I will give you honor and praise among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes, says the Lord." The verb kabats, vu, gather, that the prophet had used at the head of chapter 2 to call the people to repentance, returns now in the divine voice as the verb of homecoming. The scattered will be gathered, the lame will be rescued, the shame of exile will become honor among the peoples. The book closes on the gathering home of a people who have not yet been scattered, written to a city that has not yet fallen, in a vocabulary that would acquire its full weight only after Babylon had carried Judah away in 586 before. Christ and the prophet's words had begun, slowly, to come true. The prophet of the most concentrated day of the Lord vision in the Old Testament becomes, in his last sustained passage, the prophet of the most tender promise of divine joy in the Old Testament. The ark is not relief after judgment. The ark is restoration that was always the point of the judgment. The day of darkness and gloom that opened the book closes in the same 53 verses, with the King of Israel singing in the midst of his people. No other prophet, in 3 short chapters, traveled that distance. Within 38 years of Zephaniah's prophecy, the Babylonian army of Nebuchadnezzar breached the walls of Jerusalem. The temple was burned. The royal house was led in chains to Riblah. The eyes of King Zedekiah were put out after his sons had been slaughtered before him. The city the prophet had named the city of oppressors fell in the summer of 586 before Christ, exactly as the book had said it would. The first fulfillment was historical, not eschatological. Zephaniah's day of the Lord arrived first as a Babylonian campaign, in the lifetime of children who had heard the prophet preach. But the vocabulary outran the event. The great day of the Lord did not stay in the 7th century. Paul, writing to a small congregation in Thessalonica around the year 51 after Christ, would tell them that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Peter, in 2 Peter 3 verse 10, would say that the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and the heavens will pass away with a loud noise, John of Patmos in Revelation 6 verse 17 would describe the kings of the earth hiding in caves and crying out, "The great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" All three are quoting, in different keys, the same prophet. The line they share, the great day, the wrath, the question of who can stand, is line by line Zephaniah's line, and the dies irae of the Latin Requiem, opening with the words Thomas of Celano had lifted from Zephaniah 1, verse 15, would carry the same vocabulary into 7 centuries of Christian funerals. This is what the 3-chapter scroll did. It compressed cosmic judgment, oracles against the nations, and the restoration of a singing remnant into 53 verses, and that compression became the architectural template every later writer working on the Day of the Lord would borrow from. The prophet of royal blood whom Manasseh's Jerusalem produced, and whom Josiah's reform would soon partly satisfy, disappeared into his own book. The Day of the Lord did not. It became the lens through which Paul read the return of Christ, through which Peter read the dissolution of the heavens, through which John of Patmos read the end of the age, and through which the medieval Latin Church read its own death. The prophet almost no one reads is the prophet almost everyone quotes without knowing.